Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sara Rosier, and I'm the news editor at Ballotpedia. Today, we're going to chat about the impeachment proceedings of the West Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals. So it's been a crazy few weeks in West Virginia. The West Virginia legislature began a special session in June, on June 26th, to consider the possible impeachment of the Supreme Court justices in the state. Justice Menis Ketchum resigned on July 27th, and on August 13th, the House of Delegates adopted 11 articles of impeachment against the 4 remaining justices on the court. So in addition to these impeachment proceedings that have been occurring, Justice Alan Lawfrey faces 25 federal charges for wire fraud, mail fraud, making false statements, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering. We're going to discuss where these issues stand and what the next steps are. Today, we're going to have Sara Reynolds. She is a staff writer for our governance team here at Ballotpedia. She's going to give us the details. First, though, we wanted to say thank you for joining us. If you are all signed up for the webinar, we apologize for any technical issues that occurred last week between our Zoom account issues. So we're glad you're with us today, and we'll be reaching out to send you some free Zoom and Ballotpedia swag if you were registered. So look out for some information on that. So Sara, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, happy to be here.
All right, so give us the overview. Tell us about the West Virginia Supreme Court.
Okay, well, the West Virginia Supreme Court is actually the Supreme Court of Appeals of West Virginia. It's the state's highest court, and it's currently the only appellate court in the state. It has 5 justices who are elected to 12-year terms in nonpartisan elections. And to be eligible, they must have practiced law for at least 10 years to preside on the court. Prior to the start of the impeachment proceedings, the 5 justices were Justice Robin Jean Davis, Beth Walker, Alan Lawfrey, Margaret Workman, and Menis Ketchum. Since the special session began, Davis and Ketchum have resigned, as you can see, and Lawfrey has been suspended since before the special session began. Governor Jim Justice also appointed former State House Speaker Tim Armstead and U.S. Representative Evan Jenkins, both Republicans, as interim justices to fill in for Ketchum and Davis. They will both serve until a special election on November 6th. They are both running in the election. Armstead is running for the Division 1 seat, that's Justice Ketchum's former seat, and Jenkins is running for the Division 2 seat, Davis's former seat. Additionally, there's one more justice who is filling in right now. That is 6th Judicial Circuit Judge Paul Farrell. He was appointed by Justice Workman to replace Lawfrey while he is suspended. And that brings us to all of the justices we have on the court right now. Something notable about the court, it's the only court in the 50 states with complete control over its budget, meaning the legislature approves the amount of funds the court receives, but the court can decide how to spend that money.
Yep, and thanks, Sara. And you'll see later that that is an important tidbit to keep in mind as we talk about why these impeachment proceedings have begun. Also, just for background, this will be semi-confusing because, one, there's 2 Saras, but also we're talking about West Virginia justices and Governor Justice in West Virginia, so a lot to keep track there. But anyway, the next thing we wanted to talk about, so the House of Delegates have now approved 11 articles of impeachment against 4 of these Supreme Court justices. What events led us to these articles of impeachment?
Okay, there's 4 major points I'd like to make. The first is this goes back to November 2017 when local reporter Kenny Bass reported on court renovation costs. And his report highlighted $900,000 in planned renovations beginning in 2009 that ended up costing $3.7 million by 2017. And he noted that each of the justices' offices cost over $100,000. The most costly was Justice Davis's office, $500,000, and the second most was then Chief Justice Lawfree's at $363,000. The report sparked a number of other articles on court spending in the press, and in January, that transferred over into the legislature. Democratic delegate Mike Pushkin called for an investigation into the justices and possible impeachment of Justice Lawfree. He introduced a resolution in February, however, that never made it past the committee phase. In any case, the controversy resulted in Lawfree's removal as Chief Justice in February 2018. The second point is the State Judicial Investigation Commission launched an investigation into Lawfree in February of this year. The commission filed a 32-count judicial complaint against him in June. They specifically said that he lied repeatedly about the cost of court renovations. He moved state property into his home. He violated court policy by installing a home office, and he hid a federal subpoena from other court justices. The state legislative auditor conducted 3 audits of the Supreme Court between April and June. The auditor found that Justices Ketchum and Lawfree failed to report the use of state vehicles for personal reasons. The audit also found that the court was aware of these tax violations by 2016. Ketchum retroactively updated his tax forms and repaid the state, but Lawfree disputed the charges. A second audit, released in May, questioned the conduct of Court Administrator Steve Canterbury, who the audit said misused state funds for rental cars. Canterbury also reimbursed the state after the audit's release. And the third audit examined court spending from 2012 to 2016. It found the court had a $29 million surplus in 2012 that fell to around $300,000 in 2016. And in fact, on Friday, the state auditor released a 4th report building on this examination of their expenses. Lastly, in June, Lawfree was indicted on 22 federal counts, including wire fraud, fraud and swindles, witness tampering, and making false statements. And in July and August, he was additionally charged with 3 more counts, 1 obstruction of justice and 2 fraud counts. And he pleaded not guilty. So these 4 things resulted in Republican legislative leaders asking Governor Justice to call a special session, specifically to consider impeaching Justice Lawfree.
Yeah, so that figure really stands out to me about the 29 million surplus dropping down to a little over 300,000. And that really comes up when you think about what you mentioned at the top of the call, Sarah, which is they had complete control over their budget. So that drop in surplus, it's really drastic. And as we'll get into the charges more, there was no control by the legislature over where the spending was happening. So that really stuck out to me there. But what did the West Virginia government have to do to call the special session? And what is the breakdown partisan-wise in the West Virginia legislature?
Well, as I mentioned, Republican legislative leaders sent a letter to Governor Justice asking for him to call a special session, which he did. He issued a proclamation, and the legislature met on June 26th. So to look at the breakdown here, as you can see, the West Virginia General Assembly is majority Republican. There are 64 Republicans and 36 Democrats in the House of Delegates, and 22 Republicans and 12 Democrats in the Senate. I should mention that Governor Justice is also a Republican.
What has been happening since the session began?
The session started on June 26th. Initially, the House of Delegates authorized the House Judiciary Committee to conduct an investigation into the Supreme Court justices. The House directed the committee to make recommendations after the investigation was finished. So on July 11th, Justice Menace Ketchum submitted his resignation effective July 27th. He was under investigation for improper use of state vehicles, but the committee did not continue to investigate him. They began proceedings on July 12th, and they examined the 3 legislative audits that were published in April, May, and June. And they also heard testimony from a number of individuals, including the state legislative auditor, a former Supreme Court IT staffer, former court administrator Steve Canterbury, the post-audit division manager, and the court finance director, among others. And the examination centered on the renovation costs. They also explored Justice Lawfrey's character and delved into illegal payments, possible illegal payments to senior status judges. On August 7th, the committee adopted 14 of 16 separate articles of impeachment against Justices Lawfrey, Workman, Davis, and Walker. The next day, August 13th, on August 13th, the full House of Delegates approved 11 of the 14 articles. And of these 11, Lawfrey was named in 7, Davis in 4, Workman in 3, and Walker in 1. And the charges included personal possession of state property, authorizing overpayment of senior status judges, personal use of government vehicles and computer equipment, making false statements to the House Finance Committee, and misuse of state funds. Article 14 in particular charged all 4 justices for misuse of funds by failure to implement a policy preventing overspending. Now, the next day, August 14th, Justice Davis resigned from the court. And from there, proceedings advanced to the Senate. So on August 20th, the Senate adopted rules of procedure. They said each justice would be tried separately and that the acting Supreme Court Chief Justice would select the order of the trials. So who will be tried first, second, third, etc. The acting Chief Justice, by the way, is 6th Judicial Circuit Judge Paul Farrell, who I mentioned earlier. Justice Workman appointed him to act as Chief Justice in case of impeachment and to replace Lawfrey while he's on suspension. The state constitution actually says the Supreme Court's Chief Justice shall preside over a court of impeachment unless it would be improper for him or her to do so, which is why Judge Farrell was appointed. And on Friday, 3 things happened. Justice Workman requested a trial date no earlier than October 15th. Justice Walker's attorneys requested that the article against her be dropped. And the state legislator's office released a 4th report as previously mentioned. And that brings us to where we are now.
Yeah, so a lot of things have happened. Just an aside for what Sarah was talking about with the senior judges. So senior judges, and I think this is applicable at every judicial level, including their senior level status, federal judges, etc. So senior status judges, they are judges who preside over cases when a sitting judge is unable. They can kind of dictate if they want to take cases or not. So just an FYI there. So apparently there have been possible illegal payments to senior status judges, overpaying of those types. And depending on the state, there are often quite a few senior judges, so that can have heavy implications on a judicial budget, I'm sure. What happens next now that we have these articles of impeachment?
Well, the state constitution gives the House of Delegates the sole power of impeachment, which they have used. And the state Senate has the sole power to try impeachment. So the process has advanced to the state Senate. And pretrial hearings are happening today, actually. They began at 10 a.m. The Senate is currently adjourned, I believe, until 2:30, and we'll get into what's been happening. But in this case, the Senate acts as a jury, and members of the House act as prosecutors. And so there are 5 House members that are acting as prosecutors. They are House Judiciary Chairman John Schott, Judiciary Vice Chairman Roger Hanshaw, Delegate Ray Holland, Delegate Rodney Miller, and Delegate Andrew Byrd. There's 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. So around 10:30 a.m. this morning, Delegate John Schott announced a potential agreement with Justices Workman and Walker. It involved a censure resolution that is, if the Senate approves that, the articles against them would be dropped. In which case, the proceedings would focus on the remaining justices, Lawfrey and Davis. Delegate Schott, when he announced this potential agreement, he said he believed that it was fair, necessary, and a good first step for rebuilding trust in the judiciary. So the Senate has adjourned until 2:30 today to look at the settlement, and then they will reconvene, and they need to approve it in order for the charges to be dismissed. After the hearings today, other hearings and trial dates will be chosen by Acting Chief Justice Farrell. Conviction requires approval by 2/3 of the Senate. That's 23 members, which means, in theory, if all Senate Republicans voted to convict, they would only need 1 Democrat to join them. And conviction could result in the removal from office and disqualification to hold office.
All right, so only 1 Democratic senator is needed if all Republicans get on board. So you've talked about the partisan breakdown in the legislature. Now let's talk about what narratives are coming out of these different, from Republicans in the state, Democrats in the state. What are the different partisan sides saying about this situation? Are they accusing that it's partisan motivated? What's the narrative coming out of West Virginia from both sides?
Democratic and some Republican members of the state House argued against impeachment. 2 Democratic delegates in particular argued that the proceedings were political ploys for Republican Governor Jim Justice to replace a 3-2 Democratic majority court with Republican justices. Democratic delegate Barbara Fleischauer was one of them. She said the proceedings were, quote, a coup, and Democratic delegate Mike Pushkin said they were an effort to take out an entire branch of government and replace it with appointments. Now, House Judiciary Committee Chairman John Schott, a Republican, he denied that this was the case. And even today, speaking before the Senate, he said the goal was never to remove or replace all 5 justices. Quote, he said, "It was never our intent, and it's not our intent here today." West Virginia's judicial elections were partisan until 2016. So we know that Justices Lawfrey and Walker were elected as Republicans, while Davis, Ketchum, and Workman were elected as Democrats. And as a reminder, Governor Justice has already appointed 2 Republican interim justices to fill in for Ketchum and Davis, who were Democrats. Now, if any of the justices were to be convicted and removed from office, Governor Justice would appoint replacements. They would initially serve until 2020, and when voters would elect new justices to fill the unexpired term. So obviously we don't know what is going to happen, but Workman's term expires in 2020, Lawfrey's in 2024, and Walker's in 2028.
Great, yeah, and the governor does have the ability to appoint, so it is up to his discretion who he chooses to appoint in these circumstances. It's become a very interesting set of partisan talking points about the motivation behind this, and we can't guess that, but as you heard from the list of impeachment proceedings and why it happened, that then allowed justice to determine who he would want to appoint. One thing, just an FYI to anybody who's listening today, we will be covering these special elections happening in November very heavily through our marquee elections. It's been identified as one of the top races to watch this year, which normally we wouldn't necessarily have a state Supreme Court election as one of our marquee races, but the circumstances involved here are such that we felt it necessary to really pay attention here, look at all the dynamics at play, and as you've heard today, there are quite a few. So what is the history of something like this? How many Supreme Court justices have been impeached across the country?
This is unprecedented. No Supreme Court justices in West Virginia have been impeached ever in the history of the state. And a study by the Brennan Center for Justice noted that in the U.S., 2 state Supreme Court justices were impeached in the last 25 years or so. One in Pennsylvania was removed from office in 1993, 1994, and one in New Hampshire was impeached but acquitted in 2000. Before this, the most recent impeachment in West Virginia was in 1989, when the House brought 17 articles of impeachment against State Treasurer A. James Manchin, who resigned before the state Senate could conduct a trial.
Yeah, so this is a very big deal. So thank you, Sarah, for this information. We will be tracking what happens with these impeachment proceedings, especially throughout the rest of the week as the Senate convenes and discusses this issue at hand. So stay tuned at ballotpedia.org for updates. Keep in the know with our newsletters, including our Daily Brew and Weekly Tap, where we will be sure to keep you updated on what's happening in West Virginia. So thanks for joining us today, Sarah.
My pleasure. Thank you.